I'm Lisa Senecal.
And I'm Maya May.
And is it Groundhog's Day? Because here we go again.
Here we go.
Well, We're Speaking starts now.
I watched on my Peloton last night, like, no! Ew, we barely stopped dealing with them and now we're going to do it again. Okay, but before anything, I don't want to get distracted the way the GOP is going to try to distract us. Georgia. I want everybody to say it with me. Georgia. Call your friends. Yes, Georgia. Call your friends and family in Georgia. Georgia needs us right now. They're going to need people canvassing, door knocking, getting out the early vote, because there is early voting in the runoff between Warnock and his opponent. Not even going to say his name anymore because I just
can't. He can't remember it. Why should we?
I just can't. I don't want to remember it. I don't even want to know it. Like, I don't even want to think about the fact that this man is like this close to getting to the Senate. We can't let it happen. I don't care that the Senate is already in Democratic hands. Y'all, I need every single one of you to make sure that we get one more blue seat in there. Please, for democracy. We need it. Thank you. I'm done.
We do need that extra one, because we know when we just had the 50 from time to time, that didn't work out quite the way we wanted. But I'm not going to talk about Democrats in disarray, because it is Republicans in disarray time right now. I made myself watch a little Fox News right after the election, and they were just all over the place. Laura Ingram's calling for another Republican election autopsy, like they did in 2013, and then completely ignored and went in the opposite direction. They're kicking this dead horse. At the same time, on Fox, they were blaming single women, saying that single women need to be married off, and young voters. Yeah, it's a great solution. And you really appeal to young women or single women by telling them that the only way that they're really appropriate citizens in the United States is if they're attached to a man. Young voters, they had the brilliant suggestion of stripping their voting rights until they're 21. That's going to be super appealing to Gen Z. They love having their rights taken away. And then they were making, in thinly veiled terms, they're blaming Black voters and rethinking new and better ways to suppress the Black vote. So if they're trying to reach out to non-traditional GOP voters, I don't know what the hell they think these plans are that they're coming up with. And like, how can they appeal to non-traditional voters and not infuriate the radicalized base that they have worked so hard to make crazy in the past 6 years? Like, those two things don't work together very well, but it's going to be super interesting watching them try to do it. And we will make sure that they fall flat on their faces.
Absolutely. If you're trying to toe the crazy line, like back and forth, you look crazy doing it and you're eventually going to fall. We all know it. We're all seeing it. We saw it in the midterms. Congratulations, everybody who put in the work, because seriously, we couldn't have done it without everybody's efforts. So thank all of you for sharing our content and doing all the things. Much appreciated. We're incredibly lucky because we have a guest tonight who is an expert in radicalization and white power movements and the GOP base, which I think might be synonymous at this point, though. With Lindsey Graham's tears, he was like, "Oh, but this is how you're treating Herschel Walker. Black people aren't going to want to be Republicans." So I'm excited about our guest. Kathleen Belew is an historian of the present, the white power movement, violence and apocalypse, and the author of Bring the War Home, the White Power Movement in Paramilitary America. And her next book is Home at the End of the World, which is where we might be right now. Hello, Kathleen. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. You're really the ideal person for us to be talking with today, because there is this weird conflict happening that the GOP has worked super hard to appeal to white nationalists, white Christian nationalists. So as a historian and somebody who's charted the rise of those movements and extremism, especially over the past few years, what's your take on what happened in the midterms?
So one of the interesting and important things we have to think about right now is that when we talk about the white power movement, what we're talking about is a coalition of people who came together after the Vietnam War and joined groups that had previously been at odds with each other. So it's skinheads, Klansmen, militiamen, neo-Nazis, tax resistors, Christian identity believers, and a bunch more.
Oh my.
This was all a very fringe movement until the very recent past. And what happened in the Trump years is that fringe mobilization has been allowed and sometimes called into our political mainstream. What that means is that the violence that we had to worry about on the fringe has now migrated into our political process itself. And it means that we have this sort of, it means that there has been an assumption that the person or people or forces who called this movement in is in command of the extremist fringe. We have no evidence that this is the case. And in fact, we have decades of activity that suggests it is not the case. It is a leaderless movement. It operates with an enormous amount of fractiousness between cells. And I don't think there's any reason to think that Trump or anybody else being deposed, should that happen, should that continue to be the case, I don't think that means that we're out of the woods.
And when you say deposed, you mean taken from power, not ending up in front of attorneys again for his many crimes and being asked lots of questions he pleads the fifth to.
Sure. Well, so deposed, I think here for me means should Trump not remain in command of a substantial part of the GOP base. That doesn't mean that this sort of extremist stripe of the GOP base leaves the party, nor does it mean that the party itself returns to a more mainstream formulation.
So we've seen a lot of political violence this cycle that we perhaps would have been very surprised by even 2-3 years ago. That kind of violence, and even though this is the leaderless movement, do you expect us to see that kind of violence going forward from these groups? Or
absolutely. So leaderless resistance is the name of a strategy that this movement has used since the early 1980s. And it just means cell-style terrorism. So it means that one or a few activists can work together towards a common set of goals without communicating with leaders and without communicating with other cells. It doesn't mean there are no leaders. It means that the leaders are hard to prosecute and that it's difficult to tie the acts of violence together because they appear as quote unquote lone wolf terrorism, even though the research suggests that this is not how we should think about them. So what happened in the Trump moment is that when this movement turned against the state and started the strategy of leaderless resistance, it did that in 1983 in a Republican moment, right? This is peak Reagan era. And the reason it did that is it thought that the kinds of political changes that it wanted were far too radical to ever achieve through mainstream politics. And activists in that moment were talking about the reinstitution of slavery, a new Jim Crow, a minoritarian government of white people over everyone else, and other things that simply would not wash, even when the country was, as these activists saw, perhaps the most conservative it was going to get for the time. So they said, the time for the ballot has passed. Now is time for the bullet. We're going to take up arms. We're going to train as a paramilitary force. We're going to conduct mass attacks. We're going to target infrastructure and synagogues and ethnic studies classrooms and federal judges. And it goes on and on like this. That was all because mainstream politics had a closed door between these activists and the system. That's not the case anymore, right? The door is open. So now My guess as a historian, and I'm not somebody who's studying these groups on the ground today, I'm not in their archives. I'm not sure that we have the archives yet. My guess is that now we're dealing with a split between activists who are still participating in that kind of old guard revolutionary style and people who are interested in mainstream political action. So now we have to worry not only about the Oklahoma City bombing, although that's still clearly on the table. We also have to worry about attacks on the integrity of our elections, about Proud Boys running for school board and intimidating school boards, about people trying to climb up the GOP command structure, and about kind of the long game of authoritarianism.
The lens of history is so valuable here because there are an awful lot of people, and I understand the instinct. After these midterms, they went much better than a lot of people other than Joe Trippi had predicted, and we want to believe that things have gone back to normal. And there was that same instinct after Biden was elected, like, whew, okay, we can be normal again now. But that lens of history that you're applying shows this has been going on for so long. What begins to de-radicalize this, or at least put it back in its box to the degree that we can have some degree of normalcy?
Absolutely. So the good news is that this moment has also really focused public attention on this problem. We have now declarations by the FBI and the DHS and a number of other important institutions that this is a huge problem, in some cases the huge problem that comes with resources and attention and money and problem solving. We also have to treat that with a degree of caution because we know that policing does not tend to impact the sorts of activists that are drawn to the right-wing fringe. It tends to redound upon communities of color instead. So we need a broad array of strategies. And the other good news is that this is the kind of problem that ordinary people can do quite a lot to help with, ranging from paying attention to these kinds of stories, even though I know we're all tired. I know it is a fire hose of news every time you open Twitter. And I mean, that's if you can get Twitter to work. I think, there's a lot. I know that it's a big ask to pay attention to yet another crisis, but if you can pay some attention to the stories about this, if you can think about it as a groundswell and then be prepared in your own community, which is where the activity is going to go. We need people at the library. We need people at the school board meeting. We need people thinking about who is running for office in the little local races that don't seem important, but end up setting municipal codes. And when there are acts of violence, when there are mass attacks, we need to treat them not as isolated events, but as part of a social problem that we all solve together. Those are the steps to really confronting this in our society more broadly.
Yeah, and it is lurking in our local areas and neighborhoods. Lauren Boebert was just, a restaurant owner and hanging out with a guy who exposes himself at bowling alleys. And now she's your native Coloradan. And, I'm fascinated by Lauren Boebert because she's like, okay, like women should be subservient to men, but we should also carry guns. Can you talk about what this means? Because this is prevalent in the white supremacist movement of the last 50 years. How does it all relate?
Absolutely. So the role of white women is something that is incredibly important, not only to the very extreme white power movement fringe that I've been talking about, but also to kind of the broader conservative tapestry of political action. And this applies to, these are not the same thing, but it is true in the broader GOP, it is true in the evangelical movement, and it is true in the white power movement, that women in these circles will say to journalists and sociologists and historians and each other, I am not political, but I am not political. I am not a politician, but, and then here they are doing the thing that is politics in these circles. So for instance, we can go all the way back to the Barry Goldwater movement, and look at the work of the Goldwater girls in doing coffee klatches and on the ground leafleting. And it turns out that a lot of the reason that historians were so surprised by the Reagan Revolution is that we weren't paying attention to women's grassroots activism across those years. And then boom, here it comes as a fully formed political movement. Now, this looks a lot different in the white power movement, where women are saying, I am just a wife and mother. And then the politics they're doing are things more like writing declarations of war and driving getaway cars and helping design medallions for super secret societies. But it's the same kind of shift where there is space for a traditional kind of political formation that allows for radicalism also. Now, the reason that that has been possible, I think, is because in the white power movement, we get this crystallized, and it exists in our mainstream politics in kind of more subversive ways, but that all of this for white power activists, the issues we think of as capital C conservative, opposing abortion, opposing immigration, opposing gay rights, LGBTQ rights too, opposing feminism, wanting women to stay home, for them, all of this is about the birth rate. It's all about the replication of the white population. And to do that, you have to police white women and have lots and lots of babies of color. Or excuse me, not of color, lots of white babies, no babies of color. So what we get is a sort of hyper focus on white women's reproduction as a political act. And that means that in the white power movement, when people say, I'm just a wife and mother, that's actually a statement of their politics and of their radicalization. And I think that appears in other parts of our discourse also, although in less sort of overt ways.
That is such a cool insight that I have never heard before. Just wife and mother is a statement of the politics. I like that so much. I really want to just ask you about Moms of Liberty really quickly, because I feel like there's some tie-in there. Can you talk about it?
Sure. I mean, there's a number of groups that are configured around this in one way or another. Another example is early on in the Trump campaign, he gave a speech to, I'm going to forget the name of it, but it was a group of mothers in Arizona who were united because each of them said that their child had been killed by an illegal immigrant, quote unquote. And I think maybe it's Angel Mothers. There's a bunch of these kinds of groups. And he did a big event with the women all dressed in white with pictures of their children. That is a strategy that has been used in the white power movement for decades, by way of sort of using the performative value of white motherhood to make a claim about politics. And we see it all over the place. It comes up quite a bit in our culture. And so I think all of these groups are variations on the theme.
So we saw in the midterms that, with the exception of millennials and Gen Z, white women, the majority, went with the GOP still. Mm-hmm. So even post-Dobbs and all the rest of the awfulness that's gone on, white women are still majority Republican voters, unless you're of those two younger generations. Do you see a real shift in the thinking of those generations, or is it as women age and move, either become mothers or move to the suburbs or whatever it is, do you expect that these next generations just haven't aged into these poor decisions?
I was like, tell us what's happening, Kathleen. We need to know so we can stop it.
Like in previous generations, were women more liberal and have, as they've gotten older, become more conservative?
That's interesting. I'm not sure I know the answer. I will say that it seems to me that the women who are most likely to be directly impacted by Dobbs are Millennial and Generation Z. I mean, I'm at the top end of Millennial, and so when we think about like women who are of a reproductive age, I think increasingly those are Millennial women. But I mean, and I do think the suburbs are a bigger part of this than we have really tackled. a lot of times, I train students in US history. So when we're thinking about the Civil War, there's a classic oral exam question in graduate school about like who really won the Civil War. If you look at culture, like who really won? Is it possible that the South really won? And it's supposed to be sort of a thinking question. But I think the question we might need to also be really foregrounding is the way that our divides are no longer regional north-south. They're really urban ex-urban, where we need to think about like it's not just about rural and city, it's about what do suburbs do to community formation? How do they move people around? And if you look at the scholarship about this in the 90s, which is sort of what I'm looking at in my next project, what we see is that people are literally being moved farther and farther apart from each other. They spend more and more time in their car. They live in bigger and bigger houses on bigger and bigger parcels, right? So they're physically distanced. There are fewer and fewer people in those houses. And we all know from COVID and lockdown that social distance has profound consequences for how we interact, for how community centers work, for how we think about our relationship to each other and our indebtedness to each other. And when you mix that with sort of this constant apocalyptic cultural formation, which I think is what we're all living through, I think it's really clear that we have two major responses to the fears of the end of time, right? One of them is to bunker, and the other is to reach out our hands to each other. And I think we see both of those things happening in large part based on how close we are together.
I'm always fascinated with that because I spend a lot of time in rural areas and then also in cities. And sometimes when I'm in rural areas, people are like, oh, you're from Chicago, or I've heard it's dangerous there, etc. And so the fear, like these things aren't invading their suburban communities. And so is it they're just buying into the propaganda, and we know people aren't attending church as much as usual. So it's like the love thy neighbor part, maybe they're missing and they're just watching Fox and it's just like, oh no, I'm supposed to hate my neighbor. What's happening, Kathleen? Help us.
Well, and I mean, I grew up in the suburbs. There are lovely people in the suburbs. There are lovely people in rural areas. I think it's more about the way we structure our communities, such that interaction is and isn't possible, right? So it's different to go to a small church than it is to go to a mega church. It's different to go to a small store than it is to go to a strip mall, right? And the way that these sort of big changes in how our lives have been physically built over the last short term, just like 10 or 20 years, have been profound. And I think we're starting to really see we're reaping the rewards of those changes. And I mean, the other part, of course, is the internet, which has been a factor in extremism for a very long time. White power activists got online in 1983, 84. So they're not just sort of newly discovering social network activism. They pioneered it way before Facebook. But what we are seeing is that so much of our life is online. It's so central and so hyper speed fast that we've just seen an exponential explosion in how much disinformation and how much networking and how much all of this can move around at a frenetic pace.
The social changes in social media are kind of obvious right now with whatever the hell it is Elon Musk is trying to do to Twitter, or not trying to do and is doing anyway. You've opened a Mastodon account. I have as well, learning my way around there.
Figure it out. I need a tutorial.
Yeah, I definitely need.
I can't figure it out.
Yeah, I gonna need even more help with that than I do with TikTok. So it's not good. But do you think that if there is not, we have become, although we're fractured, and more in our own groups, we're also very much addicted to doing battle with people online all the time. That conflict and rage is something that Americans have, increasingly found appealing. Do you think there's a place for social media where that doesn't happen, where we can be building up a community of like-minded people and that people will actually want to be there?
You know, I wonder about this because I as a person who studies extremism, I entered Twitter with a lot of safeguards, a lot of filters, a lot of like, turn off my messages, turn off the mean stuff. And I have not found it to be a fractious place. I have really found it to be a place where I've met journalists and graduate students at other institutions. There's a very nerdy group of Twitter historians. You can go on hashtag Twitter historians and see us nerding out about various.
I love that.
And sometimes there are debates and arguments. And I mean, maybe I'm broken in this way. They do say that the collective noun for a group of historians is an argument of historians. So it may just be that I'm an argumentative person in an argumentative field, but I haven't found it to be as bad as all of that. And I mean, there's a lot of hatred and awful stuff online everywhere. I sort of subscribe to the idea that like, I don't think you can unring the bell that is the internet. I don't think we'll ever root out hate and negativity from the internet. I don't even think we can get, one small part, like, I don't even think we can get neo-Nazis off the internet. I don't even think we can get the word Nazi off the internet. There's a lot of research that says that deplatforming does slow those folks down and that the guardrails really are helpful. I think what we need is a new kind of civics and a new kind of thinking about how we consume information. We used to teach about this in school. We used to think a lot more about how to responsibly consume news. And I think having some of that early in our education system might be a better place to put our resources than sort of trying to wrangle what's already out there in the wild frontiers of the internet.
And it's not just the wild frontiers of the internet. It seems like it's also our pop culture and media. We see anti-Semitism seeping its way into places like SNL. Not sure if you saw the Dave Chappelle monologue, but a lot of people were talking about how that is normalizing anti-Semitism. So can you talk about it? Because it feels like we're seeing a lot of hate come from almost like it's like the mainstreaming of hate, because we are seeing it in the moms groups. And so things that used to just be, you would whisper it and never talk about it, now seems to be like on NBC.
Are we back?
Oh, you're back.
I'm sorry. I think it dropped for a second.
You looked so good frozen that I didn't even know you were frozen.
Well, that is then the one time that's happened. So I feel like usually I freeze in a horrific face.
I know.
I just thought you were looking at me very intently. I was like, I love it. I have this woman's attention and she's so brilliant. I just absolutely love it.
I think we were talking about SNL and anti-Semitism.
Yes. And that it seems like we've seen the mainstreaming of hate on places like NBC. And so I'd love for you to talk about that and how it's playing out in our culture.
I mean, I think to me, the danger of any of these forms of hate speech, whether it is racism or anti-Semitism or misogyny, or, I mean, there are many, many varieties. I think the problem is when it is presented without context. So I think it is a problem for a platform like SNL to run something like that and then not to follow up with information, right? Because the problem isn't well, maybe it's all a problem. But to me, the big problem is less the initial anti-Semitic remark and more the failure of the media company to follow through with historical context. I mean, the reason that we could take something like the Chappelle sketch where he talks about it being anti-Semitic to suggest that, gee, there's a lot of Jewish people who work in Hollywood. And his point was sort of like, you can't say it. Oh my gosh. He can say that. He's a comedian. Okay. But I do think that NBC then has a responsibility to say like, hey, the reason this is a problem is that when people have made these comments, historically, it has been followed by these kinds of violent actions against the Jewish community. And hey, did you know that this is also connected to a movement that is interested in violence against African Americans? I mean, like the problem is in the lack of context around the comments. So, I mean, I think it's the same sort of problem where the New York Times ran a feature last week or early this week about the newly elected prime minister of Italy, who is a openly eco-fascist prime minister. And it was all about her suits and the way that she's choosing to present herself in fashion. Okay, I mean, that's interesting, but we need the context. We need big context, because all of us culturally, I think, have a memory that's 1 to 2 years at most. And I think we need this context. You can't count on it that people have had the information and the education to know why these kinds of things are a problem or what kinds of violence they're attached to discursively.
This historical perspective of yours is so fascinating and really important for all of us to be thinking about all the time, for the reasons you were just describing. Things that are happening now, we understand better, more fully, what the implications are if we understand what the roots of those things are. So thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being part of historical Twitter.
Yes.
You're definitely going to have to now.
Twitter historians, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll
Well,
definitely have to check it out. And please do come back and talk with us again, because obviously these problems aren't going away anytime soon, and your voice is really valuable.
Well, thank you very much. I'd love to come back anytime and enjoy the rest of your conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. She's great. I have 1,000 more questions though. So I'm all like, this show needs to keep going. I want to talk about Trump. I want to talk about DeSantis. They're both fascists, just in different ways. They attract different parts of the movement. There's a lot to talk about. So we'll definitely have to have Kathleen back for sure. And let us know in the comments if you're following this kind of stuff in your local area, because we need you to be, as Kathleen just mentioned, we need everybody. Like, nobody gets a break. So sorry. Hydrate and go root out the racists.
Yeah, I mean, let's keep rolling from the success that we had in the midterms, and let's have that energize us rather than focusing on that was a lot of hard work. Let's think about the payoff that we got, but there's a lot more to do. So yep, we're back in the trenches. We had a couple of days off. Now
the playlist. That's what I say. Get some music that you can like dance to through the next couple years. That's just like, you're like, I'm gonna save democracy, like that kind of thing. I'm all for it. Dancing it out's a great form of therapy for me. And I'm it's good that most of the time I'm alone in my house. Not everybody has to watch me have therapy. It's not for everyone, I'm afraid. For everyone, we'll transition here. Rick and Tara are back tomorrow with a breakdown at 7 p.m. Eastern. Please do join them. Always a fascinating, wildly entertaining conversation. What else do we have coming up? We've got a new ad. Oh, yeah, because someone announced.
Yeah, take a look at this, and we will see you not next week. This Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Gobble, gobble, gobble.
Thanksgiving, everybody. And we will see you on the 30th.
Donald Trump is back. Angry, vengeful, ready to take back the White House and wreck America again. And who's going to stop it? These weaklings and losers? Business leaders? They'll bend the knee and write the checks. The press? Too many are just here for the show, ready to both sides America to death. The law? He'll ignore it, like he's always done. No, the only people who will stop Trump are Americans ready to put country over party, ready to put differences aside to save this country, ready to work, ready to fight, ready to stand up when he knocks America down, because it's not about left and right. It's not about rich and poor, black or white. Like it's always been, the choice is simple. It's America or Trump.